Hi, welcome to my blog. Kristen Limley, the student-centered math teacher. I'm making several blog posts about questions that I've answered seemingly over and over and over and over again, and one of them is about how to group students. Because in my classroom, I group students every day to work on their student-centered math tasks, and I change their grouping on a regular basis. And it just depends on what I'm trying to accomplish as to how I group them. So I'm always rearranging my room, and students know that when they're put into a group, there is a purpose, there is a reason. I don't do random groups, and they even, after the first couple of times, begin to ask me, so how did you group us this time? Because they know that it's purposeful and that it's for being productive. So if you look at this, this is basically some example structures that I might use in my room. I might put the desk side by side facing the front, the whiteboard and the Eno board at the front of the room. If I'm doing partners, I also might do groups of 3. So I put 2 people facing the front, and then I turn the third desk sideways where they can see the group, they can see the board. And then sometimes I have groups of 4, so like little pods. And so these 2 students are facing each other, and these 2 students are facing each other. So they're staring at one partner across from them, then they have another partner beside them, but they can all still see the board. And I change it up depending on, one is just student maturity and how well can they handle sitting that close to that many people, but also according to my purpose for class. So for example, I am very fond of homogeneously grouping students where the same ability level as far as their understanding of the current concept, because from one concept to the next, students' understanding and how quickly they catch on to new material changes. So I continuously regroup according to who understands what we're doing right now, maybe who's still struggling with it, and those groups are very flexible and they change from, every couple of days. I could be moving students into different groups. This activity, How Sweet It Is, which is in my Better Lesson curriculum, is a great one for differentiating linear patterns. And you can differentiate it while still giving every single group the same pattern. So when you discuss as a whole group, it appears everybody was given the same information, and they were. But if you group them homogeneously, you can differentiate within this activity how they are given their information. So if I have students who just really have not caught on to expressions and equations and representing patterns algebraically, I would put them all in one group, probably in a group of 3. I'm fond of groups of 3 for this. And what I do is I put 7 candies in a cup, and I give them the cup, and they have to count it. And the table distinctly says, this is your initial amount. They record the 7 Skittles. Then I come around and deposit 3 more in their cup. And so they would record on their first deposit 10 Skittles, and then I bring them 3 more, and they would record 13, and then 16. And so they get the information very directly. And then they work together to continue the questions. If this pattern continued, what would you have on the 10th, the 25th, and the 100th deposit? And then they turn that into a more algebraic method, an expression to represent the pattern. Well, if you have some students who are beginning to catch on, they are not, way ahead of everybody else and needing to be pushed dramatically, but they have a pretty good understanding of the basics, then I would put them together. And what I usually do with them is I shake the cup when I walk up. I said, do you hear this initial amount? Okay, it's there. Here's your first deposit. Now you can count it. Or sometimes I really kind of mess with them a little bit, and I give them, here's your first deposit. They hear it clink. Here's your second deposit. And they hear it clink. And I like to use Skittles because Skittles tend to not interfere with anyone's food allergies. So you can basically withhold the initial amount from them, but you show them the pattern of change, either by bringing them 3 every time, or if you think they can handle it, you let them hear each deposit but not see it until the 2nd and the 4th, and you could even bring them the 6th deposit, so that they find the pattern and they have to go back and find the initial amount. Then you've got groups that are really advanced, and these are all in the same classroom. We all know that. You could give them, if you group them homogeneously, let them hear the initial amount. Give them 3 Skittles every 2 deposits. So deposit 3 and let them know this is your first and your second. Then deposit 3 and this is your third and your fourth every time you come visit. And they only get to count the 2nd, the 4th, and the 6th and understand that they had a Skittle and a half. So they had a fractional amount of Skittles. And they can do that. But again, it's for if you group homogeneously, you can differentiate every student's learning experience and still have basically the same pattern. The only pattern that would be different is the group that only received a Skittle and a half. Everyone else was still receiving 3 Skittles per deposit and 7 for the initial amount. So when you discuss the patterns and the expressions, they would be identical. It's just their experience with engaging with that pattern was different if you group them homogeneously. So for this activity, I would put them in desk compilations like this all over the room, and I would put my struggling students together and my students who are really starting to sort of get it, and then my students who really need to be pushed, and give them the same pattern but in 3 different ways. So that's a good example of homogeneous grouping. Sometimes, though, I do group them heterogeneously. I differentiate, and I would do this particular activity as partnerships, as a pair. This is a formative assessment lesson from the Shell website, and it's one where they are expected to understand that equivalent expressions can look different. So when they take the pre-assessment, I particularly look at question C where it says add 4 to n and then divide by 5. And some students do it very horizontally, 4 plus n, division sign, 5. And they use the parentheses. You hope they use the parentheses. Sometimes they don't. And then some think in fractions as division problems, and they will do 4 plus n as a numerator divided by 5. And it's not that one person's wrong, but they are different yet equivalent expressions. And I look for that in this activity on purpose. And so I let students know that the reason why I picked these partners, it's not that one person's right and one person's wrong. You could both equally be correct. But you think differently about the way you structure your expressions. And because in this activity, you are looking for equivalent expressions, like here, 2 times the quantity n plus 3 is equivalent to 2n plus 6, but they're not told that up front. They have to sort of figure it out as they go, and there are others that are equivalent. Then I tell them I want them to be with someone who doesn't see math the way they see math, because having 2 different perspectives will help with the card sorting, and it will make their task together much easier. So I would sort heterogeneously not by ability, but by the way they see math. Now, sometimes sorting heterogeneously, I change it up from not just sorting them by the way they see math, but literally by the ones who are keeping up in class and ones who are not. So on that particular one, that formative assessment, I would do pairs. In the past, I've done quads, groups of 4, and sometimes I put the ones who are just slow, the ones who procrastinate, who don't get started on time. I put them in the front of the room, and I put the ones who are catching on to everything and they're very self-sustaining in the back of the room. Why? I'm usually, up front, at least for part of class, and so when I give them an activity to begin, they're right there at my fingertips. I go right to my slowest group and make sure they get started first, and I put my next slowest group beside them, and I work my way around through the slowest progressors, and then by the time I get to the back, they're usually already done. But sometimes what happens is slower students, ones who are just procrastinators, not that they don't understand, they just don't like to get started. They try to waste time. They just propel each other to waste time so much that you eventually have to put them with someone who will keep the pace up. So that's when I would switch to an activity like break even. So with break even, it's an activity where they have a partner and both partners have to participate at the same time. So I would do partnerships at this point and break up the 4s or put them in 4s. Put a student who usually progresses really quickly with a student who's slow, and a student who progresses quickly with a student who's slow. So shoulder partners or face partners. So two faster moving students with 2 slower moving students. And again, it's not necessarily the ability, or understanding the current concept, because I hate to say ability, everybody's got ability to learn, but people just understand different concepts at different speeds. So I would put 2 students who really understand quickly with 2 students who are a little slower to understand or slower to get started. I would give them a partner activity. So this one, they have an initial amount on a scale, and then they're adding by a constant rate of change, and they're trying to balance the scale and break even. Well, every time you take a turn, both partners have to take a turn. So it winds up looking like this. This is partner 1's initial amount, partner 2. But partner 1 only adds, this is 6, and this partner's adding 9. How long until the scale breaks even? Well, with this, you have to take turns at the same time. And then you also get around to writing the algebraic expression to represent your pattern and determine the number of turns you will have to take together to make the scale break even. So I used this activity recently with my students when I needed the student who generally jumps right in and gets started to get the other student to jump right in and get started. And again, it was just more of a timing, and they were pushing them to go through the activity more quickly instead of me having to hover over them and push them to get started. Then that kind of worked out better. It kept everybody at the same pacing when I felt like my students who were just a little slower, a little bit of a procrastinator, to get started when they were dragging their feet. So I did groups of 4 with particular partners side by side. And then I could even do my quicker to start students across from each other if I wanted them to work together a little more homogeneously, and put the partners that are just a little slower to get started on this side, so the slower partners could be a homogeneous pair, but a heterogeneous pair this way if I want a slower to get started student to work with a quicker to get started. So again, sometimes I do it by what do they understand. Sometimes I do it by their pacing of how quickly do they get their materials together and get going. Sometimes I do it by the way that they see math. They see it the same way, they see it a different way. There are a lot of different purposes, but the one key is you always have to have a purpose. There has to be a reason why those students are working together, and you have to be very verbal and explain to them this person or this group of people are the best for you in this particular situation. They will make this experience the best it can be, because if you use grouping intentionally, your lessons and activities can be phenomenal at learning experiences for your students. But if your grouping is unintentional and random, then these activities can be the most frustrating part of your teaching experience. So I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions, if I didn't answer anything you were thinking about. Thanks.